Fairy tales are both stories of transformation and symbolic poetry. They are gifts from our ancestors, offering symbols and guidance for our human development. In this show, artist, philosopher, and teacher Sean Kramer will lead us into the imaginal realm of fairy tales, where we will find healing images and wise teachings for our own journey through this enchanted world. So welcome to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales.
Welcome back, everyone, to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales. Today we will meditate on the very mysterious and powerful fairy tale called Fitcher's Bird. The subtitle I gave to this meditation is Dissociative Fantasy versus Symbolic Imagination. And fairy tales are among the very greatest works of human imagination. The poet W.H. Auden even said of fairy tales, and especially of the Grimm's collection of fairy tales as a book, that it could be a foundational text for an entire culture and civilization, like the Confucian classics, or the Bhagavad Gita, maybe in India, or like the Bible. It's an interesting idea, like to think of that, founding a culture on the fairy tales. Even imagine, say, going to church and listening to fairy tales. A friend of mine who, when he was in graduate school for psychology, he said once a week a group of graduate students and professors of different subjects, psychology, philosophy, would gather together and discuss a fairy tale. They considered them so deep and profound that these graduate students and professors would dedicate time just to thinking and meditating on these fairy tales. So these great works of imagination, the fairy tales, they're not only great works of imagination, but they also teach us important things about imagination, while giving us some of the great examples of what imagination can really do for us humans. Examples of really healthy and healing forms of imagination. And this fairy tale, Fitcher's Bird, is a fairy tale that offers us both very striking, powerful, poetic images, but also gives us images about imagination itself. So we will notice those and reflect on those and learn from them as we go through this fairy tale. So to enter this world of imagination, the imaginal world of fairy tales, I'd like us first to begin with a meditation. So bring your awareness into your body. You can close your eyes if that's fitting. And use your breath to gather your awareness and draw it into your body. Let your awareness fill your whole body, as if your body is a vessel and your awareness just fills it. So you're aware of the inner space of your body. And imagine that your inner space, your inner world, is made of different rooms. And explore those different rooms. And imagine or feel any area where there's tension or some kind of resistance or avoidance. And maybe you know somewhere in your life that there's something you're avoiding or withdrawing from, or maybe you can just feel it in general, that those things that happen to us as we go through life, where we pull back from life through fear or weakness. And imagine that as a locked room, somewhere that you're not quite comfortable going, somewhere that also keeps you from life, weakens you. Now imagine you find a key. Hold that key and feel the energy that the key gives you, an energy of readiness, that you feel ready to move forward into this area of life or activity, task, whatever it is, where you formerly felt avoidance, anxiety. Now take that key, put it in the door, and open up the door. And see from the open door flying a beautiful white bird. And as you see that beautiful white bird flying, you feel yourself now stronger from having faced that area of life, from having opened that door. And now with more strength and readiness, you go forward into life, into the world, into growth. Now take a few breaths. Let that image go. And now we will journey into the story of Fitcher's bird. And I'll tell you the beginning of the story, just the beginning, and then we'll pause to imagine and reflect on the landscape of the story, what I like to call the story map, and some of just the symbolism, and then we'll move through the events that happen in the landscape. So the opening situation of this fairy tale is that there's a village where people are living, nearby a dark forest. You might already be reminded of Hansel and Gretel, our last fairy tale. But what's been happening is that pretty young girls have been disappearing, abducted, and no one knows where they've been taken or what has happened to them. So right away we have the fairy tale jumping into one of these areas of real fear, one of these frightening things in life. It's reminds me of these signs that I'll see occasionally, or that I would see growing up, of a picture of some person missing, a missing person. This is really one of the very frightening areas of life in our existence and experience. And the fairy tales really go into those areas. And so right away we're into this. Hansel and Gretel, our last fairy tale, we opened with a situation of real family trauma where the parents were discussing abandoning their children, leaving them to die in the forest. Here we have a situation of young girls disappearing, and the families don't know what has happened to them. in fairy tales, when they go into these dark areas, they don't go into them just to stir up anxiety or despair. And they don't even spend a lot of time arousing fear or suspense. They state these terrible things in a very simple way. And because the fears are already there, they're not trying to create fear, they're just touching on deep fears that are already in us. And then they're trying to move forward somehow, to mature or resolve or heal, somehow move us forward from the fears. So though they touch on these dark things, they're not like a slasher movie where it's just about stirring up the fear or exploiting terror. The fairy tales just touch on it. It's already there. We have these fears of abandonment, of the unknown. They simply notice it and then take us forward. So let's see where this fairy tale takes us. So what's been happening is there's a wizard, and he's been disguising himself as a beggar, and he goes to houses. And so he's at a house now, and he knocks on the door. In this house, there's a father and 3 daughters. He knocks on the door, and he's disguised as a beggar, begging for bread. So the oldest sister goes and gets some bread and brings it to him to give him bread, to feed him. And he simply reaches out his arm and gently touches her with his finger. And as soon as he touches her, she leaps or flies into a basket, a large basket that he's carrying on his back. And he, with large strides, walks into the forest and through the forest. So let's pause here a little bit before we see where they go. But this image of the man in disguise reaching out to touch the young girl, and she just leaps in his basket. And he's disguised, and she's drawn to him by wanting to feed him, to care for him. So it's really, I think it makes sense on a lot of levels, but if we think of this story of these young girls and who are swept away by this man who appears to be someone they can care for and mother, but they don't really know who he is. There's a very clever line in Shakespeare where one character, it's in King Lear, one character asks another how old that person is, and the person responds by saying, "Well, I'm too old to fall in love with someone for singing." And in other words, that he was a young person once, and the characterization of being young was that he was able to fall in love with someone for singing. And it reminds me of seeing film footage or videos of concerts of singers with audiences of young girls just screaming in this hysteria and fainting toward this, young man who they have really no idea what kind of person he is, but just because he's singing, they are just melting and just swept away like these girls, just the touch, and they leap into the basket. They're carried away. And that's an interesting capacity of humans, that by just a little sign, external sign, our imagination and desires take over and completely fill in a whole fantasy. So in this example, these young girls at the concert really know almost nothing about the person they are falling madly in love with because he's singing, but their imagination is filling in a whole fantasy. So the wizard has swept these girls off their feet and is carrying them into the dark forest. Through the dark forest. And where does he bring them? He brings them to a house, a mansion. And it is just beautiful, wonderful. It's luxurious, it's comfortable, it's all, as the wizard himself says, all that they could desire. And when he brings them in, he says, "You will be happy here, I will attend to you, and give you all that you would desire. My dear," he says, "you will certainly be happy with me, for you will have everything your heart can wish for." So, it seems not so bad. But it's all that who would desire, we might ask. It's not simply all that any human could desire, but it's a certain fulfillment of desire. So to answer that question, let's look now at the landscape. And imagine, as we did before in our first fairy tale, that we are going up in a hot air balloon to see the landscape. And let's first remember and look back as if there's the fairy tale world and there's different little counties we can see. And let's look over first the landscape of Hansel and Gretel and compare it. I think right away you'll see a lot of similarities. If you remember the landscape of Hansel and Gretel, it was basically the house, the family's house on the edge of the forest, the dark forest, and in the middle of the forest, another house, the cake and candy house in the midst of the forest. And the story moved through that space. So clearly, I'm sure you're making the connections yourself. This story of Fitcher's bird has the same basic landscape. There's the family home, the dark forest, and in the middle of the forest, a house. In this case, not a candy house, but a comfortable, luxurious house with beautiful furniture, silver, gold, hangings, beautiful curtains. So they're different houses, but what's similar about them? Both of them are images of the character's desire. Or we might say their image, their ideal. But in Hansel and Gretel, it was the child's image or dream of happiness, a house made of cake and candy, like the factory of Willy Wonka with chocolate rivers and trees that grow candy. This is what a child would imagine and dream of. And what is the image in Fitcher's bird? Whose image of happiness is that? Well, in this story, it's the image of a young girl. So no longer a child, a young girl who's adolescent, young adult, who's thinking of moving out and finding a husband and a home. It's a comfortable home with beautiful and luxurious furnishings. So we see, just by comparing those two, that inside the forest, we see the person's desires, but the desires are different as a person changes, develops through life, goes through different developmental life stages. In Hansel and Gretel, we had a little more detail about what happened outside the forest in the family, and we saw that inside the forest was very much like the children's dream of their life outside the forest. In other words, they were longing for a mother who would nourish and shelter them, but their mother turned out to be a witch who wanted to kill them. So we could almost read Hansel and Gretel as if going into the forest was them falling asleep and dreaming about their life, their desires and fears in the imagery of a dream. And inside the forest, commonly in fairy tales, things get strange, unreal, and definitely more dreamlike. And it's common in writers on fairy tales that they see the forest as they sometimes say, the unconscious, but meaning the person's inner world. When you go into the forest, you're going into the inner world, the dream world, the symbolic world of desires and fears. And fairy tales themselves are this kind of thing. They're images of an inner world, an inner experience through symbol. So let's go a little further because there's something else in the house. So this oldest daughter is in the house with the wizard, and the wizard comes to her after some days and says to her, I am going on a journey, and I'm going to leave you alone here. And I'm going to give you all the keys to the house so you can explore, wander around, see how wonderful it is here, how happy you will be. But then he gives her another key, says, except the room to which this key goes. There you must not look on pain of death. If you go there, it will be your death. So you can look everywhere in this house except in this room behind the door to which this key opens, which he gives her. He gives her also something else. He gives her an egg. He hands her an egg and tells her, guard this egg carefully, carry it with you, for a great misfortune would come if you were to lose it. Then he goes and leaves her in the house with the keys and the special key to the forbidden room and her egg. And she takes it and promises that she will do what he says. So when he's gone, she starts exploring the house and sees just how wonderful it is. Each room seems more wonderful than the next, just full of splendor, comfort. And as she's going through the house, she passes a hallway and looks down and sees the door to the forbidden room. She looks, not intending to go in, but wondering what might be there. So she just will look at the door. She won't go in. She'll look at the door and the key. She examines the door. She looks at the key. The key doesn't look different than any other key. She puts it in the keyhole and just moves it a little, and the door opens. She walks inside. What's in the room? The room has in the middle a basin, a tub. Around it, all around the room, is blood splattered. There's an axe And inside the tub is blood and body parts of human beings, all body parts floating in the blood. And when she sees this, in her shock, she drops the egg into the basin. So she now has to reach her arm down through that and get the egg out, which is now. She quickly goes out of the room, closes the door, and tries to wash off the egg, and with no success. When she seems to clean it, it looks stained again. So the wizard comes back, and he asks for the egg and the key. Now she hands him to him. She's shaking, trembling, her whole body. And he looks at the egg and sees that it's stained. He knows that he's been in the room. She's been in the room. And he says to her, "You went into the room against my will. Now you go back into it against your will." He knocks her down, grabs her by the hair, drags her through the house, brings her into the room, and cuts her into pieces. Now, compare this furthermore to Hansel and Gretel. In this Fitcher's bird, we have these concentric circles almost. We have outside the forest in the middle, this luxurious house, and inside the house, this room, and inside the room, the basin of blood and body parts. We're going more and more inward, more and more kind of into the inner psychological world and state of somebody. So not only is it what's in the forest an image of the person's really deep desires, but it's at the same time an image of their fears. Just like in Hansel and Gretel, the cake house was an image of their desire, what they wanted their mother to be for them. And the witch was an image of their fear, of what their mother was or what they were afraid she would be, devouring, abandoning, murderous. So in this story, we have an image of a young girl's desires for happiness, a home, comfort. But inside that is an image of deep fear and dread that this ideal situation really hides something horrible and frightening. And this is something that the fairy tales do. They give us images of our deepest desires and fears. Now in both, again, Hansel and Gretel and Finch's bird, this image of what's in the forest is an image of desire and fear, and it's also, they're both images of something that appears good, wonderful, desirable, but really is something bad or harmful. There's the cake house that looks wonderful, but inside there's a witch, and when the children are inside, fed and in bed, the story says they laid down and went to sleep thinking they were in heaven, but they were really in a kind of hell. They were deceived in what they imagined the situation really was. In this fairy tale, we start off with a wizard who's disguised as a beggar, and the girls are captivated by him in his disguise. And then they go into the forest where there's a house that looks beautiful but has a locked room that contains something horrifying. This is one aspect of the fairy tale world, or really the world we're in, as the fairy tale symbolizes it, that there is often a difference between appearance and reality. the way things appear to be and the way they really are. And in our journey through life, this is one significant cause of people failing to reach happiness, of instead ending up in misery and as unfulfilled human beings. That by following an imagination and desire based on appearances rather than reality, they are led into a kind of destructive trap or situation. And it's this, we might call this a kind of enchantment, that the world is enchanted. And if we came from another realm where things appeared the way they really are, we would be struck by that here. How is it that things are so deceptive, that things and people appear one way and turn out to be another? And it has a lot to do with our imagination. Like the people falling for the singer, right? Their imagination fills in something that is not real. The writer C.S. Lewis was once traveling. He went to visit his uncle who lived in England, in a part of England where he had never been. And when he got there, he said to his uncle, "Gosh, it's not at all like what I imagined it to be." He imagined where his uncle lived, and when he got there, he said, "It's nothing like what I imagined." And his uncle said to him, "What right did you have to imagine it to be anything at all? You've never been here." But we do that. We imagine places where we haven't been. We imagine stages of life that we haven't experienced. It's interesting to me when people talk in a very general way about, well, sometimes I've heard about saints or holy people. They'll say, saints are like this, or saints would do this, meaning saints as like fully realized human beings. People do that also with the term poets and artists. They kind of project something into these images. Of course, saints and fully realized human beings, that's a category where we can just fill in with our imagination, because most of us, at least, have not been there, and we don't really know what a fully realized human being is like. Now we notice that the girls, and this happened actually, we'll move ahead a little in the story. He goes back again to the same house and gets the second sister. And she comes back and the exact same thing happens with the key and the egg, and she looks in the room and drops the egg in. He discovers it and he kills her too. Now they're given a choice that they can remain in this kind of luxury and bliss, but the condition is not to look into this room. A kind of denial or avoidance as their condition for happiness. And so it's a beautiful image for a lot of things, a lot of states of being, human beings, where we can remain in a kind of comfort and happiness by not looking at something. So let's go on now to the next half of the story. That was the first half, might say the descent of the story, which is common in fairy tales. The dark downward staircase. But now this fairy tale is going to move in an ascent and in the path of kind of transformation and healing. So the wizard goes to the house again, and gets the third and youngest sister. In the same way, he touches her, she leaps into his basket, he brings her back to the house, gives her the key and the egg, and leaves. Now, she does something different. She puts the egg aside to guard it, but she does go into the room. She goes in the room and sees what's in there and sees her. So she takes the pieces, she finds all the parts of her two sisters and starts laying them out on the ground and laying them out in their proper place and relationship of their body parts, the hand, the arm, the foot, laying them out. And when she finds them all and lays them out, arranges them on the floor, they mend together and come back to life. And all the sisters embrace each other and are happy and joyful. So the first sisters were, say, dismembered, cut up by the wizard, and the third sister puts them back together. You could say she remembers them, puts them back together and remembers. When the wizard comes back, he sees that her egg is not stained, and he says, "You have passed the test, now you will be my bride." And the fairy tale says now he no longer has power over her, but she has power over him. So she hides her sisters in a basket with gold and tells the wizard to take the basket of gold back to her family. She tells the sisters when they're back to tell the family members what happened, and so they can come out and help. And he tells the wizard that she will be watching him from the window. He must not stop on the whole way back, but must keep walking until he gets there to deliver the basket. So while he's walking, it's so heavy, he's carrying the sisters, he's sweating, he decides to sit down and rest. And one of the sisters in the basket says, "I see you, I'm looking from the window. You're not supposed to sit down, get up and keep going." So he gets up, keeps going. Same thing happens again. One of the sisters in the basket says, "Don't stop, I'm watching you from the window." So that goes on until he's all the way back and delivers the sisters to the family. Meanwhile, the third sister back at the mansion, it has invited guests to the wedding, and she takes a skull, a grinning, smiling skull, and decorates it with flowers and a bridal veil, and puts it up in the window, smiling with flowers from the window, this grinning skull. Then she goes, takes off her clothes, and sinks her whole body into a barrel of honey, comes out covered with honey, and rips up the feather bed and rolls around in the feathers. Now she's covered with feathers, and she walks out of the house. As she's walking down the road, she meets some of the wedding guests. And they say to her, "O Fitcher's bird." It's in a poem, so here's one English version. "O Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" She says, "I come from Fitcher's house quite near." "And what," they ask, "may the young bride be doing?" She says, "From cellar to garret she's swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween." And they move along toward the house, and she comes down the road, and now she meets the wizard, and the same exchange goes on. "Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" And she says, "I come from Fitcher's house." And the bride is sweeping and cleaning the house. They're I'll interject here. Some people wonder, it's called Fitcher's bird, and in this little poem, she mentions that she's Fitcher's bird, and no one really knows. There's no clear answer. It's kind of lost why that word is used. The wizard, the bridegroom, gets to the house and looks up and sees the skull in the window with the flowers grinning at him. And he smiles back, thinking that's his bride. And he goes into the house. All the guests are in the house. The wizard is in the house. And the relatives of the girl, the bride, board up the house and set it on fire and burn the wizard and all the guests alive. And the girl goes down the road back into the world and the village covered with feathers, with the wizard's house burning down behind her. A beautiful image to end the story. That's one that I think would make a good illustration. Let's go back now and see how we might interpret this story. And when I look to interpret a fairy tale, we can always take little parts and kind of pull out different possible symbolisms for parts. But what's convincing to me is some way that the whole fairy tale holds together. If we can find an aspect that really makes sense of the whole and the parts, that's where I feel like we've maybe got at some of the heart of the fairy tale and the meaning. So to get at what I think is a unified interpretation, let me first describe what one of the meanings of a word dissociation in the state, like when it's used of in psychology, dissociative identity disorder. And I'll give an extreme example to make it clear. And it happens to people because of trauma sometimes. So someone might be undergoing some trauma, some physical trauma, emotional trauma, abuse. Can you imagine someone's, say, laying on a table? Sometimes with injuries this can happen, or other kinds of trauma. The person's on the table in some trauma about which they really can't do anything about or don't know how to deal with. What can sometimes happen is the person feels themselves lifting up, maybe going up to the ceiling and looking down and seeing the trauma happening as if to someone else. And if this happens repeatedly, many times, that part of themselves that, say, floated up to the ceiling can actually tend to take on its own personality. Maybe they give it a different name, as if there's one person who suffered and another person who didn't suffer. And this is one explanation for what's called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now, if we look at this fairy tale in an overall way, I think it makes a lot of sense if we see it as a story of someone in trauma, the process of trauma and healing from trauma. The image of the beautiful mansion or house with this locked room in which there's something horrible We could and possibly take the story as an image of a marriage or relationship, which looks good, but has something um, bad or traumatic at the heart of it that people are afraid to look at. And if they do look at, maybe they fragment or fall apart like the first two sisters. But it could also be of the same person's inner world. The house could be the person's soul or mind, psyche, where they have some area that they are not able or ready or willing to face. So they have a locked door. And know that by keeping that door locked, that's the only way that they can hold together and maintain some comfort, peace, or happiness. Something that someone cannot face, in which they may actually fall apart. Maybe they're not ready to face it. Sometimes advice is given to look into your shadow and kind of tear the veils and look at the truth. And well, that's not always the right thing to do. It's something that really depends on the person and ourselves and when we're ready and what we're ready for. So the first two sisters could be seen as the same person, just different stages of their development when they are not ready to go into the room, that they might really fall apart, so that their dissociation, the locked door, they're cutting themselves off from that experience or memory or part of themselves, is what actually keeps them together for a while. Then we see in this story that the third girl, which again could be the same person just at a different stage, she begins to make choices for herself. She actually chooses to take power, to take back her power, and to face and remember, to come back together from the dissociation. So her development, at first, the egg, her potential, her life is undeveloped. But once she faces this thing, this locked door, she then begins to grow and flourish and sprout her feathers. So the egg in the beginning is connected with her becoming a bird at the end. The egg is a potential form of life. It's things that a person could be, could become, could do, could experience in life, but they aren't developed. They're just remaining potential. But instead of having this potential very defensively hidden and protected so that it just remains potential and can't grow, in the second part of the story, it's allowed to become something, to grow. In this line, I think this brings together a lot of the story, and there's a psychoanalyst named Donald Kalshed. He wrote a book called The Inner World of Trauma, and it helped me a lot with this fairy tale. He talks about the dream life, the imagination of people with trauma and their healing, and see the images of fairy tales. So could be a very interesting book if you want to explore this more. The Inner World of Trauma by Donald Kalshed. Now, So it's maybe not too far-fetched to see the sisters as maybe just different stages of one person, but we can maybe go a little farther, and maybe I can convince you that the wizard too might be actually part of the same person. And the wizard is interesting because the wizard is he bad or good? Well, he obviously is bad that he cuts up the girls, but it's ambivalent, right? He's the one who gives the egg. He's been holding the egg, the potential of life, and he gives the key to open the door. So he's intriguingly ambivalent in who he is, what he is, whether he's good or bad. But if we see the story as an image of the process of trauma and healing from trauma, it makes a lot of sense. Because when someone is traumatized, their dissociation, their creation of this fantasy house and the locking of the door is a defense, it's a protection. And at the time, it's necessary. It's what allows them to preserve the egg, their potential for life, that it's not completely destroyed. But over time, it becomes no longer defensive but destructive. So say someone who's been traumatized, say in relation to intimacy, and then they grow up, they start to become close to someone, but then they back away to protect themselves. They're afraid they might get hurt again. And now the wizard that at first was protecting them is now harming them, is now keeping them from growth and life. So the wizard is part of ourselves. We act as a wizard. We have a wizard part of ourselves that can create an enchanted house in a locked room, maybe for our defense and protection at one stage of life. But then that becomes a stunting of our growth later, and the wizard now has to be gotten rid of. So let me finish, I think, by talking about the subtitle I gave to this fairy tale, Dissociative Fantasy versus Symbolic Imagination, and how those, I think, are symbolized in this fairy tale. The wizard can be the image for dissociative fantasy, that is, that kind of imagination that is dissociative, maybe you could say escapist, that creation of that fantasy mansion or castle that is keeping us from some part of reality that we are avoiding or afraid of. And might not always be bad, it might be something good, but we're just not ready to grow there, or we're afraid. So it's an imagination that withdraws us, cuts us off from life and reality. Whereas the third daughter, the girl, especially with her feathers, she's an image for another kind of imagination, symbolic imagination. The word symbol in Greek etymologically means to throw together. Balein means to throw, and sim means together, to bring together. The opposite in Greek is diabolic versus symbolic. Diabolic in Greek etymologically means to throw apart, to separate. Dia is apart, bolic, together. So symbolic is bringing together, diabolic is cutting apart. So the wizard is a kind of a diabolic imagination. But the girl with feathers is symbolic, and I think it's interesting that she doesn't become a bird, she puts feathers on herself. she brings the spiritual into the body, into the physical, and out into the world, into life. And it allows her to move into the world, back into life, away from the enchanted captivity in the castle. So maybe if Salamon is there, are there any questions? Or
Can you hear me?
comments?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah. We had a question from Ash, and she said, what if the egg was not an egg, but a baby that was still in its mother's womb, the mothers being the captive girls? What if all that blood is not just blood, but also symbolizing that these women had miscarriages, thus losing the trust and faith of the wizard who killed them?
Yes, I think that seems like a possible interpretation. I think, and I think the fairy tales are deliberately put in a very symbolic, poetic form to be open for different interpretations. I think that would be one application of a kind of a trauma experience. But I also think it's written in such a way that it has a common application, so that it's been told over time and resonates with people who not only have that very specific kind of experience and difficulty, say a miscarriage in a marriage and that what that can bring in a relationship, but I also think it is made and written so that it also applies to all of us, and which is why it draws us, because we all continually go through that struggle of areas of life that are afraid of, and then that when we are ready, we meet them and we grow through them.
Nice. Another question we had was, is Fitcher the wizard?
It seems like, because she says she came from Fitcher's house. But again, it's from what I've studied, no one has a clear explanation of that word. It's mysterious. It's kind of unusual. There's different kind of guesses at it, but we don't know. And it's funny that it's titled after that, something that we don't know. It makes it kind of mysterious.
Cool. The last question came from me because I was really interested. What does it mean when they said, peeping I ween?
Say that again. So what's the question?
What does it mean when in the story it said, peeping I ween?
Oh, and that's one translation of that little poem or song. She says, she's saying that she's on the road from cellar to garret, meaning from like basement to the roof, that the bride is swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween. I suspect, I think, that is saying that she's looking from the window, and that's where she's peeping from the window, that's where she put the skull. So she says that the bride is up in the window, and you'll see her when you get there. Look up in the window, she'll be looking out at you.
Nice. Very, very interesting fairy tale.
Yes, it's one of my favorite fairy tales. And so should we finish with a little meditation?
Yeah, sure. I can play some music for everybody for that.
Okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So let us again bring our awareness into our body through our breath. As we breathe in, imagine we're pulling our awareness and filling our body with our awareness, our presence. And imagine and feel an energy, a light within you that is your connection with the powers of life, growth, transformation of the universe. The powers that gave us birth, that increased our size, that moved us through childhood and adolescence, adulthood, that will continue to move us through life, death, and relax any tension, release any resistance to the changes in life that these powers of nature and growth are moving us through. The changes won't stop, even if we don't want them, but it's part of something vast, bigger, leading us to something more amazing and joyful than we are able to imagine. So with our breath, out-breath, release any resistance to change. With the in-breath, connect yourself with these powers of growth and transformation of the universe. And we thank all these powers for bringing us into life, into this journey, and we trust in where they are leading us.